Memphis, Tennessee. On the far side of the Mississippi River, the land smooths out in a broad, level plain. Below this veneer of rich farmland, one of the planet's most powerful earthquake zones lies hidden. In recent history, the Earth has trembled often here, but rarely enough to cause serious damage. So there hasn't been much concern for earthquakes. The population has grown to over 10 million people in the region, and most development took place with no regard for earthquake safety. The earthquake zone lies buried in the heart of America. It trends along the Mississippi River between Marktree, Arkansas, and Cairo, Illinois. Scientists call it the New Madrid seismic zone, named after a small town in southern Missouri. This is not the original town we see here. The first one vanished in 1812, when the strongest series of earthquakes ever known on Earth tore the region apart. That was a long time ago, but scientific evidence shows that the New Madrid earthquake zone is still very much alive. On a clear winter night, the sky above the earthquake zone lit up with what looked like lightning. Below, a massive trembler with a magnitude of 8 or higher struck near Marktree. A month later, another jolt as strong as the first struck near New Madrid. Incredibly, a third great quake, the strongest yet, rocked the area just 15 days later. Between these shocks and for months afterward, the earth trembled constantly. Earthquakes were so frequent, an observer wrote, the earth was in continual agitation, visibly waving as a gentle sea. The Mississippi River was profoundly disrupted by the earthquakes.
There are stories in the 1811 earthquake that the very calm Mississippi River suddenly had rapids in several areas along it. If a fault crossing the river moves, if it throws up part of the river floor, you will have rapids. There were also stories that the river ran backwards in a few points.
The eyewitness accounts from 1811 and 12 indicate that the river was essentially unnavigable. There were vast amounts of downed trees and debris floating in the river. The banks had caved. Sandbars that used to be in one location perhaps sunk and others rose in other areas, so that the entire character of the river was fundamentally different.
The quakes caused large tracts of land to warp upward, while other tracts sank down. Reelfoot Lake near New Madrid was created when the land heaved up and dammed a running creek. When it was all over, an area the size of Tennessee bore the effects of the earthquakes. Buildings were damaged over an area as vast as the state of Texas. Eyewitness accounts spanned the entire nation east of the Mississippi River. St. Louis, Missouri, 125 miles from New Madrid, reported severe shaking, badly cracked stone buildings, and hundreds of chimneys thrown down. Similar reports came from the more distant city of Cincinnati, Ohio, 300 miles away. The quake's seismic waves traveled right through the Appalachian Mountains to the east. They arrived forcefully on the Atlantic coast, 600 miles from New Madrid. In Charleston, South Carolina, cracks opened in the mortar of stone buildings. The bells of St. Philip's Church rang out for a short time. Clocks stopped working in the coastal city of Savannah, Georgia, where 4 large shocks were felt. Furniture was tossed about in people's homes. Further yet from New Madrid, moving furniture woke residents of Washington, D.C., who thought they were being robbed. Shaking interrupted an early morning meeting of Congress. The earthquakes were felt sharply as far south as New Orleans, though local newspapers reported little damage in the city. There was even a report of shaking from the state of Florida. To the north, at least 8 shocks were distinctly felt in Montreal, Canada, 1,200 miles away. All in all, 2 million square miles, well over half the United States, was shaken by the New Madrid earthquakes. This is the largest area ever known to be affected by any earthquake anywhere on Earth. The Great San Francisco earthquake in 1906 matched the power of the strongest New Madrid shock. It had a Richter magnitude of 8.3, enough to devastate San Francisco. Beyond the city, the quake had a damage area of 12,000 square miles. That's 20 times smaller than the area of damage for the New Madrid earthquakes. Earthquakes are normally seen as a California concern. And while quakes are not as common in the New Madrid earthquake zone, their enormous damage areas put millions of people at risk in the central United States. Damage areas are so large partly because of the zone's relation to global plate tectonics. The zone lies at the core of the North American tectonic plate, one of 12 major plates that form the outer skin of our planet. The plates are floating on molten material below, forcing them to crash together or pull apart at the edges. Over 90% of all earthquakes occur where plates meet. But the plate's cores, or cratons, have remained relatively stable for billions of years. They have become rigid. When earthquakes strike, seismic waves travel great distances through this dense, solid rock. At the edge of many crustal plates, the landscape reflects the violence of rocks grinding together. California straddles the boundary between the North American and Pacific plates. The rugged landscape is geologically very young, and seismic waves break up quickly in the broken landscape they created. But there are exceptions. October 17, 1989. San Francisco's Marina district was heavily damaged by the Loma Prieta earthquake, but the quake's epicenter was over 60 miles away. In between, the heavily populated Bay Area suffered relatively little damage. The Marina district was hard hit because it is built on very soft sand and mud. Ironically, part of it was once a lagoon, which was filled in with sand and rubble from the 1906 earthquake. Seismic waves sped away from the Loma Prieta quake's epicenter through hard bedrock below. But nearing the marina, they slowed down in the loose surface materials. This caused the waves to grow into destructive surges at ground level. The New Madrid earthquake zone lies buried in the Mississippi River Valley. Connecting with the river is a vast network of more rivers, streams, and lakes, all draining the wet climate of the mid-continent. These waterways eroded the land and left valleys of loose sediment over hard crustal rocks below, a dangerous combination. Seismic waves travel great distances through the rigid crust, then build to violent force in soft river valley sediments. By coincidence, this is where most people live. The face of the New Madrid earthquake zone has changed dramatically since the great quakes of 1811 and 12. The region has become a major agricultural and industrial producer. The busiest transportation corridor in the nation, the Mississippi River, winds its way through. Crowded interstate highways and a dense web of railroads crisscross the earthquake zone. Below ground, natural gas and oil pipelines connect refineries in the south with customers in the northeast, where 1/4 of the nation's energy is consumed. In Memphis, Elvis Presley's Graceland attracts more visitors than any other home in America, except the White House. And Memphis Airport serves as distribution headquarters for the world's biggest freight carrier. The wilderness of 1811 and 12 is indeed gone. And as the works of people replaced it, the New Madrid earthquake zone remained silent. So the area grew up unarmed against the fury of earthquakes.
When an earthquake does happen in the central and eastern U.S., the damage areas are going to be a lot bigger, and there's going to be a higher density of damage than you would see for a similar sized earthquake in California. Most of the buildings in the central and eastern United States are constructed from unreinforced masonry, which has virtually no resistance to strong ground shaking. In fact, the last major earthquake that happened in the central and eastern U.S. was in 1895, and we've developed this whole new infrastructure since then that hasn't been tested by a strong damaging earthquake, the same way that California seems to get tested every 10 or 20 years. There's a strong earthquake that knocks down buildings, and they put up new ones that are designed to withstand or resist those forces better. But we haven't had the benefit of that kind of testing in the central and eastern U.S. So when one finally does happen, the projection is the damage is going to be a lot more serious.
Susan, can you come look at this, please?
When will the next large earthquake strike? What will it do to the central United States? For decades, scientists have been searching for the answers, but the earthquake zone does not reveal its secrets easily. The Mississippi River, running chocolate brown with silt, buried the zone under 3,000 feet of mud. Advanced earthquake studies developed in California do not work well here.
We have to sample everything from the surface because the seismicity is between 5 and 15 kilometers deep. You can't dig a hole that deep and look for something. We don't quite have that technology. In a San Andreas-like situation, you can see the fault. You can walk out and you can find the trace of it. You can see it in the dramatic topography that creates San Andreas Lake. But in New Madrid, it's not right there for us to see. It's not right there for us to map.
Borrowing methods used for oil exploration, scientists looked through the surface layer of mud and probed the rocks below. In the early 1970s, they discovered a buried swath of fractured, twisted rocks, about 200 miles long and 40 miles wide. The structure was named the Reelfoot Rift. The late Dr. Otto Nutley, a geophysicist at St. Louis University, used newspaper reports to locate earthquakes in the rift. His results have stood the test of time, despite the reliability of old news stories. Modern instruments corrected the reliability problem.
Up until 1974, we just knew that earthquakes were occurring down in the Boot Heel, Missouri. 1974, St. Louis University was able to establish a modern, dense regional seismographic network. As soon as that was installed and earthquakes were recorded, very strong patterns emerged showing where the earthquakes occurred in the region. We, with our seismic networks, can record and locate an earthquake about every 2 days, and that would be an earthquake about magnitude 2 to 2.5. And certainly that level of activity, the number of magnitude 5 earthquakes that we have seen in the last 30 years, is much larger than anywhere else in the eastern United States. So relative to other areas of the eastern United States, New Madrid is a hot spot.
The earthquakes trace out a zigzag pattern when plotted on a map, but their epicenters are actually located 2 to 10 miles below the surface, along deep faults in the Earth's crust. These cubes represent earthquakes along deeply buried faults. Swinging below New Madrid, seismicity picks up, then dies out farther north. To learn what causes these quakes, we must journey back in time 500 million years. At that time, the continent began to slowly pull apart. Molten magma swelled up from below, causing the crust to bulge and crack open at the surface. Extreme heat and pressure continued splitting the rigid crust, allowing magma to shoot up through fissures and erupt on the surface, forming volcanoes. The Reelfoot Rift was tearing the continent in half.
Now, this is a fairly common geologic process worldwide, and when it happens on a large global scale, it can form new oceans. A new ocean is opening up right now in the Red Sea area, for instance. But many rifts are not successful. They fail. They never make it to the stage of actually splitting a continent and creating new oceanic crust. And Reelfoot Rift was one of those.
Over the next 300 million years, the volcanoes in the doomed rift went extinct. The thin, fractured crust cooled back down, collapsing under its own weight to form a long, wide valley. Ancient oceans then flooded much of North America for millions of years. They left behind thousands of feet of sediment, which collected in the sunken Reelfoot Rift. Through the eons, the rift made several weak attempts to pull apart again. Magma started up old fractures, but never reached the surface. 60 million years ago, rifting stopped. The crust sank down once again, and natural erosion filled the rift with another layer of sediments. The Mississippi River began flowing down the Rift Valley after the last ice age, about 10,000 years ago. But down below, the shattered, rifted rocks remain.
You've got a much weaker overall crust than you would out in the rest of the craton. And that's where we find large earthquakes in these stable continental areas. So we feel that it's the ancient faults of the Reelfoot Rift system that are generating the earthquakes today.
The ancient faults are kept alive by subtle tectonic forces. Stress in the Earth's crust is squeezing the rift from the east and west. When stress is great enough, the old faults, which are at an angle to the pressure, slip suddenly, causing earthquakes. The southern end of Reelfoot Rift, near Memphis, is currently under the most stress. With a tendency for big earthquakes to strike at the ends of faults, this is a good candidate for the zone's next big quake. The question is, when?
I would not be surprised to witness a greater than magnitude 6 earthquake in my lifetime out here. I'm comfortable that we know roughly where, in the broad sense, somewhere in the current very active seismic zones, there will be a magnitude 6 or greater earthquake, certainly in my lifetime. But we still have a lot more to learn. We don't know when the magnitude 8s will occur, probably not in my lifetime, but possibly. We just don't know.
With few defenses against earthquakes, even a magnitude 6 to 7 earthquake could inflict heavy losses in this region. Damage will be concentrated where geologic conditions are most hazardous. A fascinating phenomenon called liquefaction will be widespread along rivers and streams.
It's a phenomenon where earthquake waves start shaking the sand. Soft, wet sand will start compacting together. Like when you take a box of cornflakes and shake it and the cornflakes in the box settle. Well, that happens with the sand, and as the sand starts to settle, the water that's between the grains of sand tries to get out from between the grains. And if there's something solid on top of the sand, like a layer of clay, the pressure breaks the surface layer of clay and sand will come erupting to the surface in sort of a liquefied form, so we call it liquefaction. And what this often causes is first of all, the ground to break up. The ground also loses all capacity to hold up objects such as buildings, so buildings will settle, sink, or tilt during liquefaction. And in many earthquakes, there are things called sand blows which form. The upper layer of clay will crack and the sand will come erupting to the surface in sort of a volcano and form a circular patch of sand, maybe 20, 40 feet across with a crater in the middle. That's very typical. We see it in almost any earthquake over magnitude 6 anywhere in the world. Well, what I'm going to do is walk on this pristine sand that can bear my weight. And once I start bouncing up and down, you'll see that as the sand starts to compact and the water comes out of its pores, the sand liquefies, losing all ability to bear my weight. And if we watch afterwards, we will see the water erupting to the surface in miniature sand boils.
This is a small sand-filled fissure caused by liquefaction during the 1811 and 12 earthquakes. From the air, huge light-colored patches of liquefied sand from those quakes are plainly visible in farmers' fields today. Liquefaction during the 1811 and 12 quakes devastated a 1,400 square mile area along the Mississippi River. Today, this same area is covered with thousands of farms and many communities. Highway 55 traverses the entire liquefaction zone. A modern, well-built interstate, it is defenseless against a liquid-like foundation. The earth levees along the river are also vulnerable, especially during high flood stage. The river's natural banks, now lined with petroleum storage tanks, grain loading facilities, a regional power plant, and long bridge approaches, are especially vulnerable.
Failure of these kind of riverbanks normally occurs by a process that we call lateral spreading, which occurs when liquefied sand and water layers beneath the surface of the ground are shaken repeatedly over a long period of time during a major earthquake. But the eyewitness accounts from the 1811 and 12 earthquakes indicate that even those low riverbanks experienced massive failure.
Transportation may be disrupted for years by liquefaction alone, but other earthquake effects will add to the problem.
In a future major earthquake, there's very little doubt that there will be major landsliding from bluffs such as this, as well as bluffs that are farther away from the river. Large amounts of this land will simply flow towards the river, and trees and farmland and the ground itself will simply be precipitated into the river. When we think ahead to future possible earthquakes in the mid-continent, navigation is probably one of the issues that we ought to deal with most seriously, because obviously a large amount of barge traffic goes up and down the Mississippi River, and after a major earthquake it is likely that the river would be unnavigable for quite some period of time, maybe weeks or even months.
Landslides and liquefaction are triggered by strong shaking during earthquakes. By itself, shaking is a serious threat to weak structures. Most vulnerable are old bridges and unreinforced masonry buildings built on loose ground. Unfortunately, many historic ornate buildings around the New Madrid earthquake zone fall under this category. When most of us think of earthquakes, we picture gaping fissures like this one. This is indeed a common scene when a quake strikes California. The Landers quake in 1992 opened a fissure 50 miles long across the floor of the Mojave Desert. But the faults of the New Madrid quake zone are too deeply buried to rupture the ground, except in massive quakes. Liquefaction, shaking, and landslides are the main effects of earthquakes in this region. And the city most threatened by earthquakes is the blues music capital of the world, Memphis. As musicians play on Beale Street, scientists from Memphis State University are evaluating Shelby County's public buildings and bridges for earthquake safety. Preliminary results are sobering. 1 out of 4 hospitals are in the highest seismic risk category. 25% of the public schools and 15% of the fire stations also fall in this category. A sampling of the county's 900 bridges showed that 1 out of 4 are at the highest level of risk. Seismic evaluation of public utilities and other critical lifelines is also underway. These studies will guide the strengthening of only the most dangerous and critical structures. Retrofitting is expensive, and there are a great number of weak facilities. On the other hand, building new buildings to be earthquake safe raises construction costs only 10% on average. But earthquake codes are weak to non-existent in the New Madrid quake zone. The state of Kentucky is an exception. They adopted modern earthquake codes in 1981, and recently surrounding states are taking earthquakes more seriously. Researchers found new evidence of 1 or more massive quakes near Vincennes, Indiana. The large cities of Indianapolis and Evansville are less than 100 miles away. Chicago, Illinois, built on a veneer of very loose lake muds, is 200 miles away. Skyscrapers are in danger of excessive swaying from low-frequency, high-amplitude seismic waves. There's another way to view this scenario. Earthquakes are at the very root of this region's prosperity. The Mississippi River flows through here because rifting opened a natural pathway to the sea. Earthquakes literally shaped this rich land, and will continue to do so.